Just a few housekeeping things to begin with. So we're going to be giving the presentation and we won't be stopping because we are recording this. So if you have a question either during the presentation or afterwards, you can type it into the little chat box that's on the left side of your screen. And then we will take those in the last few minutes. We will address those. We'll leave some time. Also, if the slides aren't viewing correctly on your screen, there's a little plus and minus sign at the bottom of the screen where you can zoom in or zoom out and see more of the slide or less of the slide. So you can make those adjustments yourself. Okay. And I also wanted to say that we are recording this, and so we will be sending around a URL for the recording in a little bit after we get done. And so if you have other colleagues who are not able to attend right now, they'll be able to access this at a later date through our website. All right, so my name is Sonia Brodt. I'm with the UC Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program, part of the Agricultural Sustainability Institute. And I have with me Elias Marvini, who's a PhD candidate in the Horticulture and Agronomy program here at UC Davis. And our other key colleague is Dr. Alyssa Kendall on this project, and she's with the College of Engineering. And so we will be presenting today some of the results from our life cycle assessment of greenhouse gas emissions and energy use in California orchard crops. And I'll start by giving a little bit of background, and then I'll turn it over to Elias to talk about the methods and the results. So a lot of you know already that climate change is a big challenge to our society, all sectors of our society, and particularly with respect to agriculture. We are facing reduced precipitation and especially reductions in the snowpack, which can change the timing of water availability. There's increases in the average temperatures, which will affect things like winter chill hours and dormancy and bloom time for orchard crops. And some orchard growers I know are already seeing those effects. And there may also be changes in the pest and pollinator populations. So to address these challenges, the state has passed this California Global Warming Solutions Act back in 2006 with the aim of reducing the greenhouse gas emissions throughout the state. And one of the ways of implementing this act is the cap and trade program, in which the state's largest emitters, which is primarily industry and power generation and large facilities like that, they are subject to a cap on their emissions, and then they can trade for greenhouse gas emissions permits. And so that process has generated some revenue for the state, which is now being invested into climate change mitigation. And some of that is going into agriculture. So there's a greenhouse gas reduction fund, which has been funding a couple different programs already in the last couple of years. And so understanding where the greenhouse gas emissions coming from in our agricultural systems and where are the hot spots of emissions within the system is really important to know how to target these funds. And so that's one of the things we are doing with this project, to identify the hot spots and different specific sources of emissions within orchard production systems. And just to review, so there are several greenhouse gases that are emitted by human activities. The most important ones in an agricultural context are these three, so CO2 and also methane, which is CH4, and nitrous oxide, which is N2O. So these are the ones we're primarily interested in tracking. And why is this important from a food system perspective to track these emissions? So we know that on a global basis, agriculture itself accounts for about 10 to 12% of all the human greenhouse gas emissions globally. And then if you actually add in additional emissions such as those required in fuel use, or emissions associated with fertilizer production or land use changes, that number actually goes up to 30%. So the agriculture is responsible for 30% of our global greenhouse gas emissions. Now in California, we know there are good estimates that say that the agricultural sector accounts for 8% of the state's total greenhouse gas emissions. However, we don't know what that number is like if we add in those upstream emissions, for example, for fertilizer production and fuel use and various other emissions that occurred through the food system. And so again, this is where this project can contribute because we're looking at the bigger picture and seeing from a life cycle perspective, what are those emissions? And because of the food system being so significant in contributing to greenhouse gas emissions, there's many different players in the supply chain now who have become very interested in things like carbon footprints and sustainability. There's a range of different food manufacturers, there's retailers, and there's this whole sustainability consortium, which includes food companies and retailers. And they are really looking into how do we measure sustainability and how do we measure something like a greenhouse gas footprint or a carbon footprint. And basically, what is considered the methodology that's still considered the gold standard for measuring these kind of footprints is life cycle assessment. So LCA it's basically like an accounting method that we can use to characterize and quantify environmental impacts of any kind of a product or a process. And it started out being applied in industrial systems, and now we're applying it to agricultural systems. And the key of LCA is that it applies a cradle-to-grave perspective. So this means that we actually have to identify and quantify all the inputs going into a system. This includes all the primary materials like the oil that's extracted from the ground to go into fuel production, or other materials like ammonia that then becomes fertilizer eventually. So we need to account for all these materials that are needed for our system of interest, and then we also account and quantify for all the products and byproducts coming out of the system. And then based on the quantities of those inputs and outputs, we can estimate the pollutants associated with that activity. And LCA is used to measure and quantify a whole range of environmental impacts of systems, but in this case we're particularly focusing on greenhouse gas emissions and fossil energy use. And LCA is not just about quantifying all the negative stuff coming out of these systems. There's also the other side to it, the positive side. And I can say that when we first started doing this work, we went around to meetings with growers and other people in the orchard industries, and people always used to say, well, forests are getting a lot of credits just for existing, for taking in all that carbon from the atmosphere and storing it. So how about us? How can we get credit? Since we're planting trees, we're essentially planting like small forests on our land. And so that is in fact one of the other things that we can do with our LCA models, is to quantify how much can orchards be credited for taking in that carbon from the atmosphere and storing it. And Elias will be talking a lot more about that in just a minute. And so I want to just quickly acknowledge the project funding. Early on, we got funding from the Almond Board of California, as well as the California Pistachio Research Board that first got us started down this route of looking at orchard systems. And then later we got a grant from the from CDFA Specialty Crop Block Grant Program, which allowed us to broaden the range of crops that we're considering. And that brings me to what are the study crops that we're looking at. So we have, of course, the almonds, and then walnuts, peaches, and plums, which are part of the CDFA Specialty Crop Grant Project. And then we're also presenting the results from pistachios here, since we have those results from our earlier project. So between all 5 of these crops, They actually account for about 85% of all the tree crops in the Central Valley and 68% of all perennial crops if you include grapes. And this map actually shows the extent of coverage. That's quite a range of coverage from north to south that these crops take care of in terms of acreage. And okay, now I'd like to turn it over to Elias to talk about the methods and results.
Hi. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in. So I'm going to be going over in a little bit more detail some of the things that Sonia mentioned about the construction of an LCA model. Okay, sorry, scrolling down. So, like any model, this LCA, life cycle assessment of orchards, describes a limited subset of reality, and this is defined by the assumptions that we've made in order to base on which to base the model. So, some of the most important things in constructing the LCA model are defining clearly the goal of the study, in this case to inform the orchard industry and policy decision makers on aspects of orchard production that affect the impacts, in particular greenhouse gas impacts, based on the current policy situation in California and the interest of orchard growers and industry players. The scope of this study accounts for resource use and pollutant emissions from nursery to post-harvest gate. So that means production of trees in orchard nurseries, any orchard field operations, and all the way through to the post-harvest hulling and shelling in the case of almonds, and drying, various other operations. This post-harvest component is actually, this was phase 2 of our project. So some aspects of it are not as solid as the rest of the model. This is just a disclaimer, but we stand by our results. So another extremely important assumption or basis for this model would be the system boundaries, both temporal and spatial. So our temporal boundary would be the orchard lifespan. This is actually a relatively unique part of this model as opposed to previous agricultural life cycle assessments. That this model focuses on California. There's been a fair amount of research done on European tree crop production. A lot of this has really been sort of just to take a typical year of production without really considering the changes in production practices over time. So that's one of the steps that we've done to advance our understanding of orchard production systems. The spatial boundary, here we're considering for orchard process modeling 1 acre of orchard. This is our functional unit for land use, would be one acre. It says here hectare because this was meant to be presented to a wider global audience, I think. But so per unit area. We also present our results on a per product mass basis, and these two functional units have different values. From the perspective of land management, you want to look at impacts and inputs on a land area use basis. But for marketing purposes, for understanding the impacts of production from a consumer perspective, we need to look at it from a per product standpoint as well. Our impact assessment. Impact assessment is the terminology we use in life cycle assessment to sort of describe putting all of these disparate pollutant emissions results into a format that is understandable and useful from a policy or a management perspective. So we've used, for the most part, the IPCC approved global warming potential. Here we present results on GWP 100, which means global warming potential over a 100-year time frame. This combines the impacts of the major greenhouse gases, as Sonia mentioned, CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, and in addition, sulfur hexafluoride, which is not a major greenhouse gas released from agricultural operations, but it is a component of industrial operations, and we are accounting for upstream, agrochemical production, fuel production, and things like that. So it does come into play, although it's much less of an impact than the other major greenhouse gases. So here is a diagram of our model. It's process-based and comprehensive. This is what we say in the LCA world. Process-based refers to the fact that we've modeled as many of the individual orchard processes as possible explicitly, rather than relying on sort of second tier kind of aggregate measurements of impacts. So an example of that would be like using economic data to determine greenhouse gas emissions. And this is something that's often used on sort of a regional or national scale. But we've done a more finer grained approach looking at individual processes and management choices. So basically, in the most general sense, this model tracks material and energy flow through resource extraction, very far upstream, as we would say, through to release of pollutants to the atmosphere. So the resource extraction part comes into play when we have we look at all of the inputs that go into a given orchard process, and we have data sets, commercially available data sets for these from other life cycle assessment studies on individual chemical components and things like that indicate the amount of resource use, energy use, and pollutant emissions that are associated with production of a given quantity of any particular product. So, for example, we say in almonds about 200 pounds per acre per year of nitrogen is added in the form of various fertilizers. Each one of those nitrogenous fertilizers has its own unique industrial process that is used to create it, and each of these has an emissions footprint attached to it. So we combine all of these in the accounting process. Okay, so still on the system boundary, what's outside of the system boundary are processing, distribution, and consumption. These are very important processes in the overall footprint of an orchard product, and we're actually working on those with phase 3 of this life cycle assessment project. I'm not directly responsible for that, so I'm pretty sure it's going very well, and we hope to have results on these aspects sometime in the near future. And this can inform the results. Right now we can say we can attach a greenhouse gas or an energy footprint to processing, distribution, consumption. These have not been accounted for. They will be. They'll have a pretty significant effect on the results. That'll be interesting to see what the footprint of almond production, how it varies depending where the almonds are actually being marketed and consumed. Moving on. Okay, so industrial processes. These include the off-site processes, chemical production, fertilizer, pesticide, fuel production, and water pumping for surface water delivery at aqueduct pumping stations and things like that. Also, the post-harvest is considered off-site. And this distinction between off and on-site is relatively important for perspective, learning what kind of management changes they can make, how their management practices affect the environmental impacts associated with orchard production. On-site orchard management, this is really the meat of the process-based model. So we look at the various orchard operations through various categories of management. So things like biomass management would be pruning, nursery production for orchard trees, and Nutrient management includes fertilizer. This also includes soil processes for nitrous oxide emissions that are related to fertilizer application. Um, the agrochemical application processes, fuel consumption, etc. We've also included in on-site operations some of the credits, the positive side of this life cycle assessment calculation in the form of carbon dioxide that is drawn down through biomass accumulation or tree growth. So as trees grow, they draw down CO2 from the atmosphere, and this results in quantifiable reduction in radiative forcing. So it means less energy being added to the Earth system. Um, so going back to biomass accumulation, temporary carbon storage. Temporary storage would be in the form of standing biomass or living trees. They hold carbon out of the atmosphere for a given period of time, and this has quantifiable positive effects on radiative forcing, energy added to the climate system, and thus climate change. Temporary storage is also in soil storage. So one of our model assumptions is that some amount of carbon is stored in soils. This is very generalized because soil carbon storage is highly spatially specific. It varies a lot depending on soil type and management. So going back to this slide, we can see the various ways that drawdown of carbon dioxide in biomass production can benefit or can counteract the emissions of the system. So temporary storage can be in living biomass or in soils or in mulch or compost. These are all store carbon on various timescales. For the most important one would be in standing biomass, and this would be over the lifespan of the orchard. In soils, we make the simplifying assumption that soil carbon is basically at baseline, so it's at some level when the orchard is put into the ground, and in so doing, it sort of resets the system for carbon storage in soils every time the orchard lifespan ends, because the trees are pulled out, all that soil is exposed, and this releases carbon dioxide. But you still get the benefit for storing it in the soil and in the trees over the orchard lifespan. And we've quantified that using an alternative to the global warming potential impact assessment indicator, which I'll get to in just a moment. The other major way that biomass co-products, that carbon storage can benefit the system is through displacement of fossil fuels. And this would be by using these biomass co-products, essentially waste products of orchard production for energy production in the biomass power plants, as well as holes going to cattle feed, which means that a certain amount of cattle feed, silage corn here, does not need to be produced. And yeah, and so these are our main displacement calculations. Moving on. So we get to some of our results. These are lifetime greenhouse gas emissions this is metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per acre. Carbon dioxide equivalent, this is the GWP 100 assessment, basically putting every greenhouse gas which has its own unique impact on radiative forcing, it puts it all in terms of CO2. So it just normalizes to CO2. And here we see the main drivers for the differences you see in each of these orchards is the lifespan here, because if we're looking at it, over an entire orchard lifespan, almonds would be 25 years, peach only 15, and pistachio is modeled at 60 years. So you can see there's just a lot more, a lot larger life cycle lifespan impact. So it might be more instructive to look at them in terms of mean annual greenhouse gas emissions. So here we see they're all pretty much similar. The main differences are in the balance of the different categories. So The similarities arise from the fact that most of these orchards are managed in fairly similar fashions. There's differences in some operations, more or less like harvest operations might be required, but in general, these trees are all pretty similar. They require, roughly similar amounts of nutrition, although this is, within a certain range. Um, and orchard management practices, pruning. So there's not the differences between these in management practice, although they're significant, are not terribly large in terms of their impacts. This is in large part because different operations are sort of like traded off. One example of this might be growing, if you're growing an orchard crop in an area that has higher precipitation, like in the north of the valley, you might have to use slightly less irrigation water so that you get a benefit from using less water in irrigation. This might be sort of offset a bit by the need for more pesticides for more fungicide due to the moisture conditions. This is just an example. So this is what we see here. Moving on, this is our energy use. So this is a little bit different as well. Again, this energy use differences are largely derived from different inputs and the different operations that are used, the different mix of operations. So some fertilizers require a lot more energy to produce than others. This is reflected in your overall orchard greenhouse gas and energy use footprint. An example in prunes, we've done the modeling on an on versus off-farm fashion. So here you can see, this also the prune results right here, they exclude post-harvest operations. As I said, this is the phase 2 of the project, and those results are just not included here for this slide. So you can see the balance of the different categories really varies between these on-farm versus off-farm versus transport life cycle phases. So the off-farm emissions are dominated by nutrient management. This is largely due to the energy-intensive nature of fertilizer production. So a lot of those emissions, a greater balance of impacts from nutrient management are due to production than to on-site nitrous oxide emissions, for example. And this is one of the important results that we see from using a life cycle perspective, because if you're only looking at these sort of in-field emissions, which has been pretty much the standard for assessing agricultural impacts, you really miss out on a large proportion of the potential impacts. And similarly with irrigation, you can see here that most of the impacts actually occur off-farm, and this is because of the electricity use in pumping. So I'll get to this a little bit later, but delivery of surface water carries its own energy use and greenhouse gas emissions footprint due to the industrial processes used in water delivery. So here's what we get when we look at the prune on versus off farm, including post-harvest. And these results, this huge impact from post-harvest this is sort of unique to the prune production because it's derived from the natural gas use in drying out prunes for market. So the prune, unlike tree nuts, the prunes they have a very high water content, and this takes quite a bit of energy to dry out. There's actually some really interesting work in prune breeding for a lower moisture content prune, as well as the use of byproducts such as prune pits that can potentially generate displacement. So some of those aspects we haven't really looked at yet in the model. So for the sake of prune production, there's actually some pretty exciting developments on the horizon. This would be something we'd address in scenario analyses. And in a way, looking at something like this, when you see in this life cycle assessment study, when we look at the impacts and we see like a particularly large or like surprising impact, in a lot of cases from the the perspective of AB 32 and the carbon cap and trade market, it's almost better to see something like that because it lets you know that there's an area that potentially could be addressed. There's room for improvement, as it were, and according to the cap and trade policy, there has to be a management change in order to get a credit. So this could be a potential source of serious industry reductions in greenhouse gas footprints. This study, looking at these categories and going through the processes in orchard production, let us pick out some major determining factors. As you saw in that first results slide, orchard productive lifespan really makes a difference when you're looking at it from over the entire life cycle of the orchard. Fertilizer inputs, irrigation, water input, these are all major factors. The biomass accumulation is very important in that this is the way, through biomass co-products, we can generate system credits. And of course, the actual yield of the orchard is very important when you're looking at impacts on a per kilogram basis. So it's not enough just to say, okay, an acre of orchard has a certain impact. We really need to consider what we're getting out of the orchard to understand the impacts, the efficiencies of production. You can maybe have a relatively high impact, but if it also produces a very large amount of usable product, then on balance it can be a lower overall impact. All right, so going on, I'm just going to give, I'm using the example of irrigation here. This is one of the most important categories in the impacts. And it's also one of the most spatially specific components of this model. So this is another way that this model is a little bit more advanced than some of the work that has come previously, is that we're really looking at the distribution of orchards and their relationships with various infrastructure and industrial sources. And one of those major ones would be the California water delivery system as well as groundwater. So looking at the surface water energy footprint, we've generated several irrigation delivery zones based on the water source. So that large blue area that you can see is this is mostly gravity fed, whereas the smaller areas with that are associated with the California Aqueduct and Delta Mendota Canal, these would be fed by pumping stations, and so they carry the impact associated with energy use in irrigation water pumping. I've crossed out infrastructure on this slide because normally, even for the gravity-fed water, we would have to consider the greenhouse gas impacts of producing infrastructure, the dams, the canals, etc. But since this is used for so many purposes, so many different kinds of agriculture and municipal water delivery, and it's very long-lived, much longer-lived than any individual orchard life cycle, we generally consider it's divided over so many years and so many applications that from just the orchard perspective, the impacts are negligible. So we've also looked at groundwater depth. This is a series of test well data points, and I've used that to interpolate groundwater energy use zones, and combining those two and applying it to the map of orchard productive area, we can do sort of an irrigation energy requirement and an associated greenhouse gas footprint per acre inch of water delivered for any orchard in the Central Valley. And there's several assumptions that go into this. One of the major black boxes is the balance between surface water and groundwater use at any given orchard, and we don't really have data, from every orchard block, the percent of groundwater versus surface water that's being used. But we can get at that in the scenario analysis and sort of look at the range, given that these are the two options for water use that we have. And so by scenarios, we can see this is for prune in particular, but we've compared here different types of pump. And you can see the solar pump um, for depending on the water mix, business as usual water mix assumes 50% groundwater, 50% surface water. So um, the surface water generally carries a much lower impact or significantly lower impact for prune production. This is because a lot of the prune uh, growing region is not directly associated with the pumped water from the aqueduct and canals. So it's more gravity fed, which has a lower impact. Um, so it's really looking at the difference between surface water, gravity fed, and groundwater use. Um, and solar pumps have a benefit there because unlike pumping via diesel pumps or electric pumps over the orchard lifespan, you really have an upfront investment in greenhouse gas emissions. And then the incremental or the marginal use of energy is sort of impact-free over the lifespan. So this is why solar comes out flat for whether it's surface water or groundwater, um, and yeah, and is the lowest of these options. So getting on to the biomass co-products and credits. um, as I mentioned before, displacement of fossil fuels is a major benefit, as well as the temporary and long-term carbon storage. So these greenhouse gas credits, they're ultimately derived from CO2 drawdown. I think I've actually discussed all of these things in the previous slide, just a reminder. One thing I should say is that we can consider the use of co-products in displacement as a benefit because we consider it carbon neutral. And this means that the carbon dioxide that's going into the atmosphere based on the use of biomass as a fuel actually came from the biogenic carbon cycle. So this is like short-term carbon. Differs from fossil fuels because it's in the active cycle between plants and the atmosphere, whereas fossil fuels are in sort of long-term geologic storage. And so when we burn a fossil fuel and add that CO2 to the atmosphere, you're increasing the overall amount of CO2 that's in this active cycle, whereas burning the biomass does not change the amount of CO2 in the active cycle. And so that's why it's considered carbon neutral. Um, the other assumption that we use in determining carbon neutrality and giving the benefit from displacement is that these orchard byproducts are really they're waste products of the production system. So the example I like to use, or the thought experiment for that to explain that would be, if we could grow almonds without growing a tree, we probably would, because that would be, you know, a lot easier if they just came out of the ground. But we have to grow the tree, and so, and you know, you see this with like the use of dwarfing rootstocks. Like the less biomass you produce, the better, because that means more production of the economic product. So we consider the biomass co-products as waste, and we don't necessarily attribute production emissions to these products. Now that is subject to, you know, some review. It depends on how we want to look at the system, and if there is a market value for biomass co-products, we may have to start thinking about it in terms of, you know, managing for both biomass and economic product. Or by economic product, I mean the fruit or nut. So, but we have not yet addressed that. So biomass accumulation differences. This is how we generate our co-products. This is also how we calculate the benefits of carbon storage. So using this time-adjusted warming potential, this is an alternative to the GWP that considers the timing of emissions or of CO2 equivalent reductions. So we input the incremental biomass increase every year, how much more CO2 is drawn down, and then this can produce a value, a single value over the entire orchard lifespan based on this incremental carbon storage. And our displacement, this is actually a rather unique situation for California because most of the other orchard growing regions in the world, Australia and Chile, come to mind in particularly, and Spain as well. Major almond producers and other orchard crops, they don't have this kind of biomass energy infrastructure. And the fact that we see this infrastructure that is it's sort of unique to the California situation, and it's sort of under threat now as we are, losing biomass plants potentially. There's measures being done to keep them open, but with natural gas prices being very low, there's sort of a loss of the economic motivation to keep these in operation, and unfortunately, that can have a really a negative impact on the overall greenhouse gas emissions. One of the main ways that this biomass energy infrastructure is favorable in California is just that there's so much less of a distance to travel to deliver this biomass co-product to the power plants. So that leaves, that reduces the overall emissions footprint quite significantly compared to other growing regions. And so taking all of these things into account, credits and emissions, we can come up with a net emissions impact. So this is looking at the balance of overall emissions in blue and the different forms of credit, displacement, biomass, carbon storage, and soil carbon storage over the individual lifespans of the orchards, and coming to a net emissions calculation. And as you can see, the credits significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And this is just under our standard business as usual scenario, also not including post-harvest. Right now, this is one of the reasons we don't include post-harvest necessarily with every assessment is because this is something that the grower doesn't have too much control over. So looking at that, there's, from the different perspectives of post-harvest processing and orchard production, looking at sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. Looking at these different impacts from those different perspectives, it's more informative to management practice. So the other major difference in this study is the use of sensitivity analysis, or the influence of specific variables to sort of determine what kind of parameters should be addressed if we're looking at changes in management and potentially increasing credits or just quantifying the credits. So here they're organized by the amount of grower control. And you can see a lot of the most important indicators for orchard impacts are really under only partial or no grower control. So the most important factors are the amount of biomass that goes to energy production, and that's reflected in the efficiency of biomass power plants and the use of more advanced technologies such as biomass gasification. Whereas on-site orchard management things like drip irrigation or burning in field have less of an overall impact. And using these parameters, using that sensitivity analysis, I'll jump back, using these different parameters here, we can determine which has the most impact, and then I can put them together in sort of logically coherent ways to generate scenarios that reflect actual management practices. So these are done by category, the biomass fate. You can see you get a huge range of potential values based on what happens to the biomass, whether it be in-field burning or use for energy production. And less of a range from the irrigation scenarios and nitrous oxide emission scenarios. These are just looking at different ways of measuring in-field soil nitrous oxide emissions. You can see this sort of reveals like the most important factors in orchard emissions and generates a range. Ultimately, we would do a more statistical analysis, such as a Monte Carlo analysis for that. But in order to do so, you need sort of large statistical data sets, and that doesn't really exist for individual orchard practices, but we're working on it. So here, looking at cumulative net greenhouse gas emissions for almond, this sort of visualization can reveal the total emissions versus the amount of carbon storage in biomass. So that biomass accumulation is really the measure of CO2 equivalents that is stored in the standing biomass. And actually, at this point, I should mention, so if we're looking at metric tons of CO2 equivalent, to put that in perspective, something like 80 metric tons of CO2 is the equivalent of annual emissions from 17 cars, is what I have here. So, yeah, that may clarify things a little bit more. All right, almost to the end here. So ultimately, the take-home messages from this work are, one, that we can actually quantify significant benefits from just general orchard practice under business as usual conditions. The storage of CO2 in soils and biomass is really important, and it needs to be taken into account. Even if we're not talking about getting credits for growers, we need to look at these factors when we consider what the total emissions footprint is of orchard production. Number two, the spatial specificity of production is really important. So this is reflected in a sort of in California scale when we look at where the orchards are in relation to water resources, as well as putting it on the perspective of global production when we consider something like California with its biomass energy infrastructure. It's very different in terms of production, overall production impacts than a place like Australia, which generally has similar or even better yields per acre, but doesn't have the kind of infrastructure that allows it to generate credits for fossil fuel displacement and for other aspects of biomass co-product use. And so this looking at the potential for greenhouse gas reduction credits can be really important, possibly going into the future, as we're talking about things like drought, where we see so many trees getting pulled out because the water is scarce and more expensive. Now, if there was an economic incentive to keep these trees in the ground, if they were considered for credits under AB 32, then furthering the goals of the cap and trade program would keep perennial crops in production and thus maintain that temporary carbon storage. We have to look at, when those trees come out, what's the alternative? And it's probably less greenhouse gas friendly than having these managed forests in existence. And finally, the options that growers have really vary depending on the orchard. Some of those major driving factors that I pointed out, lifespan, total biomass accumulation, these are things that growers may have more control over if we talk about actually managing the orchard for both biomass production, actively managing it, I should say, for biomass production and for production of a fruit or nut product. So, thank you, and I'd like to acknowledge our funders and all of the collaborators and growers and industry representatives that have been really instrumental in developing this work, and also our publication for the almond model and results has just come out in Journal of Industrial Ecology, and it's open access, so I encourage everybody to take a look. Thank you very much. I'll open up the floor for questions. So yeah, we can, I guess, type questions into chat and answer them now. And this is going to be put up on the ASI site as well. Yeah, so there'll be a link, and we can do questions at any date. All right, thank you. for that. So, Laurel, in answer to your question, we don't actually have any plans to conduct the webinar again, although given the technical difficulties, we might think about scheduling that. It might be nice to have an error-free run, but the webinar will be posted online. A link is coming soon, and hopefully we can edit it to sort of minimize the disruption from getting disconnected and resetting Adobe Connect. Um, how do we do that? Yeah, it's not really coming up. Yeah. Okay, Elena, so you're asking about carbon storage and soil. So this is actually, as I mentioned, yeah, when I got sort of cut off at the difficult time in the presentation. The carbon storage is actually, this is sort of a black box in the model in the sense that we don't really have data on enough sites. We have only carbon storage data, I think, from one of our collaborators from Russ Lester's farm, and that's definitely not a typical California orchard situation, as he does a lot of sort of experimentation with biochar and cover crops. So what we've done is we found in the literature from it's from the California Biomass Collaborative, Kreutzma and Field 2007, I want to say. We can probably add that in if there's any interest. We can make a note of it. Um, but they did a much wider survey of soil carbon in orchards of various ages throughout the Central Valley. And so they came up with sort of a generalized assessment for California orchards in terms of amount of CO2 sequestered in soils per year or per acre per year. And this is derived from like root exudates and mulched prunings and leaf drop and things like that. So we've just used that literature assessment and put it in. And our other assumption was that this sort of per acre per year carbon storage measurement starts at the start of the orchard lifespan, once the trees are in the ground and the ground's not being torn up for planting and for for tillage and orchard leveling and such. And it continues over the orchard lifespan from 15 to 60 years, depending on the orchard. And then at the end of life, when the trees are knocked over and pulled out of the ground, and this also the assumption would be that another orchard is started afterwards and restarts the life cycle, so that all this carbon is lost when the soil is tilled and the orchard is leveled. This may or may not be accurate, but we don't really have data to quantify that precisely. So we go with these simplifying assumptions. And as you can see from the, I think these are fairly conservative assumptions in the sense that probably not all soil carbon is lost, but rather than trying to make a guess as to how much is retained, we thought it more conservative of an assessment to quantify it in this way. And it's not, well, it really depends on the orchard lifespan, I guess. So for some of these orchards, it's not quite as significant. It's really a small contributor to the overall carbon storage. Hmm? Yeah. Yeah, please. Sonia, Ted is going to Sonia is going to answer your question. Um,
Yes, in answer to Ted's question about whether this assessment is available as a computer model, we would love to do that. Unfortunately, it's a whole additional project to kind of create it as a create a user interface that works with the underlying models, and that's a little bit beyond the scope of our current funding. However, I want to mention that there is something called Comet Farm, which has been it's in existence currently for other crops, I believe field crops, and CDFA is contracting with people to actually adapt that model to orchard crops and other California crops. It is not life cycle based. It is just looking at impacts from within kind of the immediate farm boundaries. But that is a user-friendly model that you can at least use to begin to get a handle on what emissions are, but it's not yet adapted to California crops, but will be in the near future, I understand. Okay, yeah, there's definitely limitations right now, and I think they're working to get it better calibrated for California, so we'll see where that goes.
Yeah, I would add, so this would be like a goal for future work is to generate sort of a limited web version of the model that growers can use to input data. This would also help us a lot getting so if a orchard grower wants to do like an assessment based on this work, then if we get enough of those grower-based assessments in, we can start putting together like more statistically significant data sets on the various parameters of orchard production in California, and this could really inform our uncertainty analysis and the overall results. Um, So, in answer to Ted's question, for our next steps, right now there's a bit more work to be done on some of these models in terms of really getting the post-harvest and harvest calculations in. Um, that should be done by the end of the summer for our report to the CDFA, and then the next step, I guess, would be putting the irrigation component of the model into there's a few more things with the irrigation that we'd like to do, but also looking at the potential for changes in precipitation and snowpack storage to affect the choices that growers are making. So I would be doing more irrigation scenarios and doing sort of a standalone California perennial crop irrigation model and publishing that. That's definitely high priority for the next year, as well as looking at the potential changes from climate change. According to the IPCC projections for California, changes in like chilling requirements, or I should say chilling accumulation and the effects on yield and water availability and things like that, and getting these into a sort of scenario model. Oh, and also one really interesting thing, I've been talking to uh, blanking on his name. Oh, Brent Holtz, farm advisor, and he's working with orchard recycling, where they, instead of using for chipping and sending to a bioenergy plant, they would chip and till the entire orchard directly into the soil. And this could be really interesting in terms of soil carbon storage. And he actually has been collecting data on soil carbon, so this can really help us improve our soil storage calculations, as well as provide an alternative scenario to the bioenergy in terms of generating credits for orchard production. Sonia, do you want to answer Johnny's question?
Yeah, so the question is, how would a producer take advantage of the credits that we talk about? Unfortunately, currently there isn't really an official system in place where the California Air Resources Board or anybody will give credits for this. This has to, in order to do that, you have to go through a whole protocol approval process that really specifies the practices that have to be followed exactly and how much you can get for following those practices. So this is something we're more thinking about. It could happen in the future, perhaps. Or, another avenue is that food companies or retailers or the people basically buying the products from the growers, might be interested in helping their suppliers to become more sustainable. And so if there's an avenue there for some kind of incentives of some type, that could be considered. But officially, through kind of the regular credits for the state process, that does not exist yet for these kind of orchard-based credits.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so just to add to Sonia's response for Johnny, one of the major goals that we'd like to see for, or one of the outcomes for this work is to see the Air Resources Board take into account these results and consider the potential for credits for growers. And so right now, the policy is generally that a grower or anybody who wants to get a credit has to demonstrate that something has been changed from previous practice, a change that results in lower greenhouse gas emissions or net negative greenhouse gas emissions. And so some of our scenario results, in particular, increasing use of biomass gasification for co-products, and this could be like, modular gasification systems for processors for post-harvest, or various other applications, or production of biochar and long-term storage of that co-product in some ways. These are all like really underutilized technologies in orchard production by our baseline assessment, and those are the kind of like potential management changes that we could make. Also, things like, changing the orchard lifespan. We can get like a significant benefit in terms of greenhouse gas emissions by keeping the trees in the ground for maybe just 5 years longer, things like that. So these might be management changes that are more feasible in the near term for growers to make. And so one of the major outcomes is like kind of finding a list of potential management changes, and then hopefully CARB will look at that and give growers the chance to get access to some of these benefits. And I think it definitely fits in with the goals of the cap and trade program, and it really should be considered. So the nitrogen varies a bit depending on the crops. So I'm responding to Johnny's question on nitrogen estimates for input. And I'll actually, so for almonds, this is 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. This is a bit less for prunes and peaches, and it's fairly similar for the walnuts and pistachios. Trying to find a scenario slide. But what we did for these N2O emissions, this also, or for our combined emissions category. So this looks at various scenarios in terms of inputs and reductions. So part of what we looked at in these scenarios was changing the amount of nitrogen that's going into the system, and yeah, and this would fall under the N2O emissions category, although it's really nutrient management. But the range that you get from like reduction of nitrogen use within like reasonable levels is actually pretty low compared to the range of scenario results you get from changing something like, you know, whether or not biomass is being used for bioenergy or things like that. So. Oh, um, yeah, so Sonia just mentioned to me these biomass credits. It's probably important to mention. I think I might have missed that during the discussion or during the presentation. So one of the important aspects to consider of biomass credits from fossil fuel displacement is the level of fossil fuel that's going into our current like electricity mix. So the idea would be, as renewable energy sources increase, the value that you get from replacing electricity generation with bioenergy from orchard co-products decreases because you're displacing more, you know, emissions, like emissions-free or zero-emission technology energy sources. So this is going forward. This is the sort of thing that, you know, we model in, as I mentioned, their next steps, the future scenarios. We're going to be working on various scenarios regarding climate change, but this, of course, you know, is looking at projections like 20, 50 years into the future. And so one of the considerations would be, how does the value in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, how does the value of biomass co-product credits change over time? So right now, in the next couple of years, this is not an issue, but you know, in a 20 or 50-year time frame, it will change. If there's no further questions, I think we're about to wrap it up. But yeah, thanks everybody for your questions and comments, and thanks for your attention. And yeah, and hopefully we'll be seeing further developments on this project as time goes by. All right.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.